The other night we were watching The Chosen. An amazing show, has a lot of back and forth, all this stuff. But The Chosen is actually a genuinely amazing show, in my opinion. And I'm going to tell you exactly why coming up here. This is what I think about The Chosen and not the episode. This episode is not about The Chosen in any way. It's about what I glean from it, when I'm watching this show and when I sit down, we watch it Sunday nights, family. And we're going through season 3 again in preparation for watching season 4. But when I actually sit down and watch this show, something happens, and it's a beautiful something. And this has been something that's happened in lots of other people's lives. I had a friend who would have been the last person I would have thought, oh, this guy having struggles with his faith. And I just saw him in the Aldi parking lot one day, and he said the craziest thing to me. So I'm going to get into all of that. It blew my mind. But I'm going to get into all of that here in just a second. Let's begin. So I was sitting there on the family room floor, just chilling out, and we were watching the TV show, The Chosen. And the thing that I get the most choked up about when I'm watching that show, or actually just in general, when it comes to my relationship with Christ, is how real of a person he is. And I know that sounds stupid, but a lot of the time, what happens is we end up, I know this is my experience at least, I get so busy with life stuff that happens that I almost forget about how it's not present, it's not forefront in my mind, about how just real Christ is. And when you're watching that show, you can say, oh man, like this, people are back and forth about like, well, should you be doing this in like don't have carved images, don't like be representing Jesus, it's idolatry or whatever. But it gives me a nice perspective just back into my own relationship with him, to remember how personal he is, how much of a real physical person he actually is. And that's the thing that's blown people's minds for so long. And other religions will say, oh, God didn't come in man's body. Like, how could he do that? How could he defile himself in that way? Because it's a crazy thing to think about, and it's a crazy thing to try and wrap your head around and understand. And a lot of us, when we grow up as Christians, or when we're new to the faith, it becomes, and when we're old, it doesn't matter. That's my point here. It doesn't matter at all where you are. But if you end up living in a way where you're just so busy all the time, and you're not taking time to be present, you are maybe reading the Bible, you're praying, but there's an element of forgetfulness that we all have. And when I think about my life, I think about what would happen, how would I act, how would I behave, what would my thoughts be, genuine, honest thoughts, if Jesus were standing right next to me, if I was actually looking face to face with him, shoulder to shoulder, like having a direct conversation with him like I am having with you right now, but like actually in front of each other. You're watching this, on a phone. You're listening to this on a phone. But if he were to pop up next to you as you're listening to this, would he be approving of the content you're listening to? What would he do, right? Like if he showed up in a second where you were sinning, how would you feel? If he showed up in a second where you were just by yourself thinking, how would you feel? What would the process be like in your own brain thinking about, oh my gosh, Jesus is like right here, right next to me. He knows everything about me to begin with, and now he's standing next to me and we're going to have an actual conversation with our mouths. Like, think about that for a minute, because it's crazy to me to think about. And so when I'm watching this show, it's just a beautiful reminder of how real and physical Jesus actually is. And it's a beautiful reminder to me that we need to live our lives in a way that is honoring to him, as though he were standing here every single second, as though every single part of our day was being spent. And I'll get to this other thing real quick, because it's very important. That happened in the beginning of the Bible that backs this up, that I was thinking about as well when I was writing this. But if we lived every single day like Jesus was walking with us, as if in the Garden of Eden, what would that be like? In the beginning of the Bible, it says that God was walking in the garden with Adam and Eve, like actually walking in the garden with them. And we hear that, and I think a lot of the time we become so used to it that we don't really think about it even though we're hearing it. But if we stop, that happens to me. That's at least what happens to me. And I have to consciously remind myself, no, they were actually like walking. And I have to put myself in their shoes in that present moment and say, what would that have been like? And when you think about it, if you're sinning, if you are in a place where you're, being tempted to sin, if you're actually sinning, what does that do to you as a person, especially after you sin, whatever it is? It makes you feel distant. It makes you feel unworthy. There are a lot of people, and I've seen this before, like when you have struggles with pornography and when you have struggles with lust, where it creates this guilt cycle. And so you do it, you feel like gross about it, so you isolate, but then that makes the problem worse, so you do it again, but then you feel even more gross about it, so you isolate more, so that makes the problem even worse. You need to break the habit and get out and get back into the body of Christ, into the church community. You need accountability, right? This is the exact same thing. It's having that accountability and having that connection. And so if you had the accountability and the connection of Jesus standing right next to you, how would that feel? And the apostles actually had that. And in the garden, what happened? Why was it? Do you think that they would have sinned if God was standing right there next to them? I don't think so. I think even if they thought what they were hearing from the Satan was true, they still probably would not have done it because Jesus was standing right there. God the Father was standing. God the Father himself was standing right there next to them. But the devil came in a moment when they weren't physically present, physically next to God, when there was distance. And that distance created a little tiny gap. And inside of that gap is where Satan slithered his way in the form of a snake and got into their minds. That's another episode for another time. The one thing that we crave most as humans that leads to most of our downfalls. But if we lived this way... Oh, and I have to tell you that story about my friend. So, one of my best friends growing up inside of school, he and I spent a lot of time together. He is still very involved in his church and in community stuff and in outreach, all of that. And I didn't see him for a long time. I left my homeschool co-op the year before COVID started. And so between that, leaving a year before all of that, so like an entire school year, and then going out, having COVID and all of that stuff, it was like 5 years. Not 5 years. It was quite a few years though before I actually saw him again. And then one day I just happened to find him in like the Aldi parking lot. He was in the store and my family was like, "Yo," or my mom, I guess, was like, "Yo, hey, he's in here." And I was like, "Oh, that's cool." So I got to talk with him for a bit and he was telling me about The Chosen and how he was watching it and how it was really changing his perspective of God and how it was really bringing him closer to Christ. And I sort of stopped to myself and I thought for a minute, this guy? Like, I never would have guessed because he and I were so pretty close growing up. And when we were in school together, and he was always so involved and active and like such a cool, awesome dude. And so it was really weird to me and it kind of messed with my brain a little bit. Like, how could this guy, I can see my own sins, but you don't always see the sins of other people. And you don't always see the minds. You don't see the sins of other people unless they're exposed or unless they expose them. And you don't see the minds of other people except for what they share with you. And so what you end up getting is this perception and this perspective of this person that's incomplete because you can't compare. And then we'll end up comparing our own weaknesses. They said this in The Chosen too the other night when I was watching it, that episode. Comparing your weaknesses to someone else's strengths. It's a bad thing to do. You don't want to do that. But that's what we end up doing because all we see are the strengths. And so we think that's all that there is to this person, and it's not. And so we have to give ourselves grace, and we have to say, where are my strengths? And we have to remember and remind ourselves that these other people have sins. They have desires of their own heart, not necessarily sinful desires, but, they're a whole complete person beyond just what we see and what we think we are. They're very much the same. But having that closeness and that personalness with God is what really brings us back. We need to let Jesus be our drive in life to be the person who we see is so physical and right next to us that we feel ashamed and completely transparent when we look at our own lives and what we're actively doing in each and every moment, how we're bringing this up and how we're approaching this. I feel confident right now that if Jesus, because he's right here with me right now, he's with you as you're listening to this. And so if he's here, am I ashamed of the stuff that I'm putting onto this podcast? Am I confident that he would approve of the stuff I'm putting onto this podcast? Are you ashamed of the stuff you're listening to, of the stuff you're spending your mental time on, the stuff you're getting into in your life? Whatever it is, there's a lot of stuff that it could be. Or is he proud of you? Do you feel confident that he would be saying, yeah, I approve of this podcast that you're listening to right now. This one, Making Men. I approve of this podcast. I approve of this message. It's got the Jesus stamp of approval on it. And not everything will be perfect, but I definitely agree with what Isaiah is saying because he's speaking the truth. And you are choosing to listen to the truth, and you are choosing to listen to words of wisdom. You're choosing to listen to just my words. So these are the things that we need to be thinking about. And somehow the end of this episode got lost. I don't know what happened to it, but I'm re-recording the ending here so that you guys have a complete, full episode. I don't know, but that's the point I'm trying to make, is if we lived like Christ was present physically in our lives, it would change how we're thinking and what we're doing, because he's watching us with his physical eyeballs every single second. And we need to look inside of ourselves and say, why does that thought change us when the thought of just his Holy Spirit being present doesn't change us as much? It's difficult almost to think about it in that way, especially when he's not physically present with us. So we need to be mentally engaged, and we need to mentally remember that he is actually with us, not physically right now. The Bible talks about we're longing for the return of him physically. But for now, we have his Spirit, which he says is better than having him here physically, because the apostles didn't want him to go. And he was like, look, guys, I'm going to be gone for a while. There's nothing you can do about that. But I'm sending my Spirit to you. And that is going to be even better than having me here with you right now. Because now he's not just with us and among us. He is inside of us. And that completely changes. That should even more change how we think about it. It should be more. We should have more conviction inside of ourselves in the way that we're living, making the choice every single day. Because he's inside of us than just him being next to us. Like if he pulled up a seat and I was like, all right, Jesus, I'm about to record this episode now. And he was like, okay, cool. Let's hear how you do. I'd feel a lot of pressure on myself. And I do feel that pressure because he's actually inside of us. So that's the point I'm trying to make with this entire episode. I hope that's clear, and I hope that gives you something that you can think about in a way that changes your perspective. And it might be something you're already doing a good job of. It might be the kind of thing where, you know what, as guys, we are very engaged. As Christian men, as young Christian men, you listening to this podcast, you're either here for the first time, but more than likely, you're already very engaged in trying to live a life that is holy and trying to live a life that is set apart for Christ. That's what holy means. Set apart. We are set apart for Christ. And then that's what we're supposed to do with our lives. So I hope that that's clear and that you guys really can use that in your own lives. I am going to finish recording this episode really quickly, editing it up, and then I'm going to get some lunch. So I will talk to you guys in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed this one, and let me know what you think about these episodes. You can find me on Instagram at Isaiah_awake. That is my handle, and I will hopefully get to connect with you and see you there. I want to grow the Instagram, but I want to grow it through the podcast, and the podcast is going to be its own thing. It's going to keep going, but for now, I want to see what happens if I grow the Instagram just through the podcast. So if you guys want to find me on there on social media, if you're even on there, I know a lot of us aren't. I'm on there because I was like, hey, this is where to go to reach people. But now I'm like, wait, you're just like me. I'm not on social media. Why would I expect you to be on social media either? So if you are, shout out to that and go follow me at Isaiah_awake. Just like that. Instagram, everywhere you can find me, just Isaiah Keene. That's where you'll get me. So I hope to connect with you on there, and I will see you guys next time. Peace out.